Hello, and welcome to this session of Scrum Master Certification course. In this session, we will discuss an interesting estimation tool, Estimation Poker. As you already know, Estimation Poker, or Planning Poker, is a derivative of Wideband Delphi. This estimation tool makes use of the Fibonacci series to estimate user stories. Let us watch a classroom Scrum session where Planning Poker is being used for estimation. The instructor distributes a pack of cards to each of the 7 participants.
Okay. All right, so all of you guys have a set of these estimation cards. These are also sometimes called planning poker cards or Scrum cards. Basically, the set that you have in front of you, this one uses the Fibonacci sequence. If you notice, they go 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and 34, okay?
The Scrum framework involves the estimation of user stories and the activities required to deliver the estimated user stories. User story estimation is an essential aspect of Scrum. However, the estimations done by individual Scrum team members and the different Scrum teams will have variations due to the complexity of the activities on hand and the time and effort required in accomplishing them. Therefore, a benchmark is required to set the estimation level so that the estimates can be made in relation to the set benchmark.
But what usually helps initially in trying to, level set the estimation process is agree on one thing in terms of how much something, a task or whatever, would take, what the estimation number is, and then have everyone kind of agree to that.
To understand the concept of planning poker, we will look at the simulated exercise conducted in the classroom.
Let's do an exercise here where together we will figure out what do you guys think in terms of animals? What would you consider a very large animal?
Elephant? Whale?
What do you guys want to say is a big animal that you all agree with?
Well,
A whale? A whale is a big animal? Okay, so a whale would be equivalent to like a 34. That make sense?
yeah.
What would you consider a very small?
Ant? Seahorse?
What do you guys want to agree as your small animal? Ants. Okay, you're okay with ants. Is everyone good with? All right, so an ant is a number 1.
Okay.
Okay, now with that in mind, and part of the beauty of how this works with the estimation cards, it's anonymous in terms of the of what your guess is. What that means is you would not want to reveal what your estimate is until everyone is ready to reveal it at the same time.
Now the team will estimate the size of an animal in relation to the biggest and the smallest animals that have been predetermined by the team. The animal to be estimated is a horse. Let's see how the estimation is done using planning poker.
So given that we've already decided that a whale is a 34
Yeah.
and an ant is a 1, what do you think a horse would be? Now don't show it to anyone yet. Pick out the card that you think for the horse
Yeah.
and get it ready.
Each member picks a card that he or she thinks is the estimate of the horse in relation to whale or ant.
Okay, what do you think a horse would be? Okay. And then the idea is you all show it at the same time. Ready, set, go. Okay, so I get 13, 8, 5, 8, 8, 5. Okay, and you got 13. All right, so the way this works is then the people who had the highest estimate and the people who had the lowest estimate explain why they chose that.
The highest number given to the horse is 13.
So the people who get 13, why would you say it's a 13?
The participant who assigned this number says that in relation to an elephant, which he would assign a 21, a horse would be a 13 in size according to him.
All right, how about a few people who guessed low? Who had the 5? You guys both had 5. Why did you guess a 5?
Now the instructor goes back to the person who chose the lowest number. Now the participant with lowest and highest estimates will have to convince each other as to why they assigned their respective numbers.
Okay, so the way that this works, you see, you have an opportunity for the folks that guess on the high end, folks who kind of explain why they chose on the low end, really as a means to kind of convince each other So, oh, okay, yeah, you know, and if you think about it that way, that makes sense. So then perhaps that would change the minds of the other people on the team, and then you do another round of the estimation.
Once the convincing session is done, another round of estimation is conducted.
So now that, you know, everyone has kind of explained why they thought it was a 13 or a 5, we'll give another chance to do the estimation. All right, so pick your card. All right.
For the same animal?
For the same animal as the horse.
Each team member re-estimates.
What do you guys think? Go ahead and share your cards. So now you see that more people were at the 8, okay? And then you will usually have someone who still is like, no, it's definitely a 5 or a 7. And then again, you do the same process, you explain, you have to convince everyone else why it's a 5. Does that make sense? So similarly, if you're doing like a task on a project, and everyone on the team gives an estimate for that task.
In Scrum, there is no subject matter expert deciding on estimates. Every team member contributes to the estimation process.
So everyone gets an opportunity to estimate what they think, and then give an opportunity for the team members to convince each other why it's, should be bigger or smaller. In a lot of cases, you'll find, oh yeah, I didn't think that we also had to do that, that task with the server or the.
Planning Poker helps the team members to reach consensus on the estimates related to the user stories and activities on hand. This tool facilitates independent thinking by participants, and thus avoiding the phenomenon of groupthink. In this session, we will look at the processes that are part of the plan and estimate phase. We will also discuss the key inputs, tools, and outputs associated with each of the processes. The processes that are part of the plan and estimate phase are create user stories, estimate user stories, and commit user stories, identify tasks, estimate tasks, and create sprint backlog. Plan and estimate phase, as defined in a guide to the Scrum Body of Knowledge, or the SBOK guide, is applicable to the following: portfolios, programs, and/or projects in any industry, products, services, or any other results to be delivered to stakeholders, projects of any size or complexity. Before we discuss the processes in detail, it is important to remember that although all processes are defined uniquely in the SBOK guide, they are not necessarily performed sequentially or in isolation. At times, it may be more appropriate to combine some processes, depending on the specific requirements of each project. Let's begin with understanding briefly each of the processes that is part of the plan and estimate phase. The first process is create user stories. In this process, user stories and their associated user story acceptance criteria are created. User stories are usually written by the product owner and are designed to ensure that the customer's requirements are clearly depicted and can be fully understood by all stakeholders. User story writing workshops, which involve Scrum team members creating the user stories, should be held. The developed user stories are then incorporated into the prioritized product backlog. The next process is estimate user stories. In this process, the Scrum Master and Scrum team estimate the effort required to develop the functionality described in each user story. The next process is commit user stories. In this process, the Scrum team commits to deliver the customer requirements in the form of committed user stories. Another process that is part of plan and estimate phase is identify tasks. In this process, the committed user stories are broken down into specific tasks and compiled into a task list. During this process, a sprint planning meeting is held to facilitate creation of the task list. Next process is estimate tasks. In this process, the Scrum core team uses sprint planning meeting to estimate the effort required to accomplish each task in the task list. The output of this process is an effort estimated task list. The last process that is part of this phase is create sprint backlog. In this process, the Scrum core team holds sprint planning meetings to create the sprint backlog containing all tasks to be completed in the sprint. Let us now discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Create User Stories process. The mandatory inputs of this process are Scrum Core Team, Prioritize Product Backlog, Done Criteria, and Personas. Scrum Core Team. The Scrum Team, also referred to as the development team, is a team which is responsible for estimating user stories and delivering the project deliverables. Scrum teams are cross-functional and self-organizing. The team decides the amount of work to commit to in a sprint and determines the best way to perform the work. The Scrum team carries out all the work related to development and testing of deliverables as well as quality assurance. Prioritize Product Backlog. The Prioritized Product Backlog contains a prioritized list of business and project requirements written in the form of epics, which are high-level user stories. The Prioritized Product Backlog is based on three primary factors: value, risk or uncertainty, and dependencies. It is also referred to as the Risk-Adjusted Product Backlog since it includes identified and assessed risks related to the project. It also encompasses all approved changes that can be appropriately prioritized in the Prioritized Product Backlog. Done Criteria. Done criteria are a set of rules that are applicable to all user stories. It removes ambiguity from requirements and helps the team adhere to mandatory quality norms. A user story is considered done when it is demonstrated to and approved by the product owner, who judges it on the basis of the done criteria and the user story acceptance criteria. Personas. Personas are highly detailed fictional characters, representative of the majority of users and of other stakeholders who may not directly use the end product. Personas are created to identify the needs of the target user base. The product owner can use personas to more effectively prioritize features to create the prioritized product backlog. The tool that must be used in this process is user story writing expertise. The product owner, based on his or her interactions with the stakeholders, business knowledge and expertise, and inputs from the team, develop user stories that will form the initial prioritized product backlog for the project. The prioritized product backlog represents the total sum of what must be completed for the project. The objective of this exercise is to create elaborated and refined user stories that can be estimated and committed to by the Scrum team. The mandatory outputs of this process are user stories and user story acceptance criteria. User stories. User stories are a simple way of documenting the requirements and desired end user functionality. A user story tells you three things about the requirements: who, what, and why. The requirements expressed in user stories are short, simple, and easy to understand statements. The predefined standard format results in enhanced communication among the stakeholders and improved estimations by the team. Some user stories may be too large to handle within a single sprint. These large user stories are often called epics. Once epics come up in the prioritized product backlog to be completed in an upcoming sprint, they are further decomposed into smaller user stories. The prioritized product backlog is a dynamic list that is continuously updated because of reprioritization and new, updated, refined, and sometimes deleted user stories due to changing business requirements. User story acceptance criteria. Every user story has associated acceptance criteria. User stories are subjective, so acceptance criteria provide the objectivity required for the user story to be considered either done or not done during the sprint review. User story acceptance criteria also provide clarity to the team on what is expected of a user story, remove ambiguity from requirements, and help in aligning expectations. In the sprint review meetings, the acceptance criteria provide the context for the product owner to decide if a user story has been completed satisfactorily. It is the responsibility of the Scrum Master to ensure that the product owner does not change the acceptance criteria of a committed user story in the middle of a sprint.
Now let's look at the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of Estimate and Commit User Stories process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and user stories. For a detailed explanation of these inputs, please refer to the discussions on these in the Create User Stories process. The tool that is to be mandatorily used as part of this process is estimation methods. Numerous estimation methods can be used as tools to estimate user stories. Some important tools are, let's begin with Wideband Delphi. Group-based estimation technique for determining how much work is involved and how long it will take to complete. Individuals within a team anonymously provide estimations for each item, and the initial estimates are plotted on a chart. The team then discusses the factors that influence their estimates and proceed to a second round of estimation. This process is repeated until the estimates of individuals are close to each other and a consensus for the final estimates can be reached. The second technique is planning poker. It is also called estimation poker. It is a derivative of the Wideband Delphi technique. This is an estimation technique which uses consensus to estimate relative sizes of user stories or the effort required to create them. Next technique is Fist of Five. It is a simple and fast mechanism that can be used as an estimation practice as well as a general group consensus building technique. After initial discussion on a given item for estimation, the Scrum team members are each asked to vote on a scale of 1 to 5 using their fingers. Used as an estimation tool, the number of fingers displayed indicate the relative estimation value. The value in using this technique is not only consensus building, but also driving discussion because team members are asked to explain the reason for their estimates. Used as a general consensus building technique, the proposal or pending decision under consideration is initially discussed. Then, the team members vote based on their level of agreement and desire for discussion. If a team member raises one finger, it means he or she disagrees with the group's conclusion and has major concerns. If a team member raises two fingers, it means he or she disagrees with the group's conclusion and would like to discuss some minor issues. If a team member raises three fingers, it means he or she is not sure and would like to go with the group's consensus conclusion. If a team member raises four fingers, it means he or she agrees with the group's conclusion and would like to discuss some minor issues. And if a team member raises 5 fingers, it means he or she wholeheartedly agrees with the group's conclusion. The last technique is affinity estimation. It is a technique used to quickly estimate a large number of user stories. Using sticky notes or index cards and tape, the team places user stories on a wall or other surface in order from small to large. For this, each team member begins with a subset of user stories from the overall prioritized product backlog to place by relative size. This initial placement is done in silence. Once everyone has placed their user stories on the wall, the team reviews all of the placements and may move user stories around as appropriate. The second part of the exercise involves discussion. Finally, the product owner will indicate some sizing categories on the wall. These categories can be small, medium, or large, or they may be numbered using story point values to indicate relative size. The team will then move user stories into these categories as the final step in the process. Some key benefits of this approach are that the process is very transparent, visible to everyone, and is easy to conduct. The mandatory output of this process is estimated user stories. After the user stories are estimated by the Scrum team using the various estimation techniques discussed in this section, they are considered to be estimated user stories. The next process is commit user stories. The mandatory inputs of this process are Scrum Core Team, estimated user stories, and length of sprint. For detailed explanation of these inputs, please refer to the discussion on them in Develop Epics, Estimate User Stories, and Conduct Release Planning Processes. The mandatory tools used in this process are Sprint Planning Meeting and Communication Techniques. The Sprint Planning Meeting is used by the Scrum team in the Commit User Stories process to plan the work to be done in the sprint. The team reviews the estimated user stories in order to commit the user stories which they can deliver within the sprint. The next tool is Communication Techniques. Scrum promotes accurate and effective communication primarily through co-location of the Scrum team. Scrum also favors informal, face-to-face interactions over formal written communications. When a Scrum team needs to be distributed, the Scrum Master should ensure that effective communication techniques are available so that the team can self-organize, collaborate, and work effectively. The mandatory output of this process is committed user stories. The Scrum team commits to a subset of estimated user stories that they believe they can complete in the next sprint based upon velocity. The committed user stories should also be selected per the priorities defined by the product owner. Now let's discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of Identified Task process. The mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of this process are Scrum Core Team, committed user stories, task planning meetings, and task list, respectively. Please refer to the discussion on the mandatory inputs of the Create User Stories and Estimate User Stories processes for a better understanding of Scrum Core Team. The tool that must be used mandatorily in this process is Sprint Planning Meetings. In Sprint Planning Meetings, the Scrum team plans the work to be done in the sprint by reviewing the committed user stories at the top of the prioritized product backlog. The product owner is present during this meeting to clear ambiguities related to user stories in the prioritized product backlog. This meeting should be time-boxed with the standard length limited to 2 hours per week of the sprint duration. This assists in preventing the tendency to stray into discussions that should actually occur in other meetings, like the release planning or sprint review meetings. The mandatory output of this process is Task List. The task list is a comprehensive list that contains all the tasks to which the Scrum team has committed for the current sprint. It contains description of each task along with estimates derived during the Create Task process. The task list must include any testing and integration efforts so that the product increment from the sprint can be successfully integrated into the deliverables from previous sprints. Even though tasks are often activity-based, the level of granularity to which the tasks are decomposed is decided by the Scrum team. Now let's discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Estimate Tasks process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and Task List, whereas the mandatory tools are Sprint Planning Meetings, Estimation Criteria, and Estimation Methods, and the mandatory output is the Effort Estimated Task List. For a good understanding of the mandatory inputs of this process, please refer to the discussion on the inputs of the Create User Stories process and to the discussion on the output of the Identify Task process. The tools that must be mandatorily used in this process are Sprint Planning Meetings and Estimation Criteria. In Sprint Planning Meetings, the Scrum team members use the task list to estimate the duration and effort for the user stories to be completed in the sprint. One of the key benefits of this technique is that it enables the team to have a shared perspective on the user stories and requirements so they can reliably estimate the effort required. The information gathered in the Sprint Planning Meeting is included in the Effort Estimated Task List and used to determine the velocity for the sprint. The next tool is Estimation Criteria. Estimation criteria can be expressed in numerous ways, with 2 common examples being story points and ideal time. Story point values are used to represent relative or comparative effort to complete tasks, whereas ideal time normally describes the number of hours a Scrum team member works exclusively on developing the project's deliverables, without including any time spent on other activities or work that is outside the project. Estimation criteria make it easier for the Scrum team to estimate effort and enable them to evaluate and address inefficiencies when necessary. The last mandatory tool is Estimation Methods. For a good understanding of this tool, please refer to the discussion on it in the Estimate User Stories process. The mandatory output of this process is Effort Estimated Task List. The Effort Estimated Task List is a list of tasks associated with the committed user stories included in a sprint. Typically, the accuracy of estimates varies with team skills. Estimated effort is expressed in terms of estimation criteria agreed on by the team. The Effort Estimated Task List is used by the Scrum team during sprint planning meetings to create the sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart. It is also used to determine when the team needs to reduce its commitment or can take on additional user stories during sprint planning.
Let us conclude this session by discussing the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Create Sprint backlog process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team, Effort Estimated Task List, and Length of Sprint. Please refer to the discussion on the inputs of the Create User Stories process for a better understanding of Scrum Core Team, and refer to the discussion on output of Conduct Release Planning process for a better understanding of Length of Sprint. The mandatory tool for this process is Sprint Planning Meeting. During sprint planning meetings, each Scrum team member uses Effort Estimated Task List to select the tasks they plan to work on in the sprint based on their skills and experience. The Scrum team also creates the sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart using the user stories and the Effort Estimated Task List. The mandatory outputs of this process are sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart. Let's look at sprint backlog. It is a list of tasks to be executed by the Scrum team in the upcoming sprint. It is common practice that the sprint backlog is represented on a Scrum board or task board, which provides a constantly visible depiction of the status of the user stories in the backlog. Also included in the sprint backlog are risks associated with the various tasks. Any mitigating activities to address the identified risks would also be included as tasks in the sprint backlog. Once the sprint backlog is finalized and committed to by the Scrum team, new user stories should not be added. However, tasks that might have been missed or overlooked from the committed user stories may need to be added. If new requirements arise during a sprint, they will be added to the overall prioritized product backlog and included in a future sprint. Sprint burndown chart is a graph that depicts the amount of work remaining in the ongoing sprint. This chart shows the progress that has been made by the Scrum team and also allows for the detection of estimates that may have been incorrect. If the sprint burndown chart shows that the Scrum team is not on track to finish the tasks in the sprint on time, the Scrum Master should identify any obstacles or impediments to successful completion and try to remove them. This concludes our session on the plan and estimate phase. Thank you for learning with us.